James Gunn's Superman is simply better in almost every aspect than Zack Snyder's DCU character, which Gunn could have handled better. Welcome to Stats In. If you're just joining us, please subscribe and don't forget to turn on notifications bell for more video. It was a risk for James Gunn, and for me as well, since Superman already had countless reboots, recasts, and origin stories with different directors having their own take on the character. Gunn's Superman could have potentially been one of those remakes that were meh, but after watching the DCU flick, I can say that James Gunn is the better director when it comes to running a cinematic universe. After being an avid Zack Snyder fan for years, I decided to watch James Gunn's Superman in theaters at 7 a.m., don't judge. Although I had doubted Gunn's style for a well-established IP like Superman, I went with an open mind and the movie changed me. No offense to Zack Snyder, who had his own darker and grittier take on Henry Cavill's Superman in Man of Steel, which I also loved, but comparing the two together, I think that the DC Universe needed James Gunn more than they needed Zack Snyder at that time. However, that humor only provides a feeling of hope in a world filled with questions and accusations. The use of songs instead of the grandiose score was a shift in Superman's persona, but somehow, the Peacemaker director made it blend beautifully into the fighting style and cinematic scenes of the movie. The fights are intense but not brutal. Superman gets beaten up, but not to the extent of Zack Snyder's movies, and yes, there are moments of peace and quiet where the world just feels right. After watching the James Gunn flick, I walked out of the theater with two things on my mind. 1. James Gunn knows what he's doing with the DCU, and I will never doubt his abilities again. 2. The DC Universe needed James Gunn more than Zack Snyder. Although Gunn hasn't run a cinematic universe before, the director took his sweet time and methodical approach in creating the DCU flick. Delving into comic books, watching other versions of the character, and telling David Corenswet to shut the F.K. up, Gunn really pulled out all-nighters to nail every character. I had doubted earlier that James Gunn's comedic undertones and use of humor might not work with a character like Superman, but boy, was I wrong. Throughout Gunn's Superman, the humor is peppered, which gives the film a mix of serious emotional moments, with a little cherry on top filled with humor, which got the film its 82% Rotten Tomatoes score. Zack Snyder's Man of Steel delved into themes of desperation, the choices of lesser evil, like Superman killing General Zod to save other people, and a very grim tone of the entire narrative. After watching James Gunn's Superman, I realized that Superman was the symbol of hope, and as such, a movie about Superman should give people hope. What Zack Snyder failed to do with Henry Cavill in Man of Steel is exactly what James Gunn did the best with his version of the character. It's not to say that Zack Snyder's DCU movies were bad. I'm a fan of Zack Snyder's Justice League, but it's just that James Gunn understood the character better than Snyder did during his production of Man of Steel. Snyder's movie felt heavy on the emotions and depicted a darker outlook on the world, while Gunn's DCU flick had a serious story to tell, but the director chose to have a positive outlook on life through the eyes of David Corenswet's Clark Kent. I can only imagine that if James Gunn had been handed the keys to the DCU before Zack Snyder, the cinematic universe would have been much better. No disrespect to Snyder, who tried his best to give us a darker and grittier take on Kal-El, but in my opinion, the DCU needed James Gunn more than they needed Zack Snyder. Which one do you think did it better? James Gunn or Zack Snyder? Let us know your thoughts below. Man of Steel was more about the survival of Superman and his fight with General Zod. Superman, on the other hand, was about the character's love for humans and what it meant to belong somewhere. The movie about the symbol of hope actually felt hopeful, rather than a fight for survival where the Man of Steel would get beaten up mercilessly. James Gunn's Superman and Zack Snyder's Man of Steel are put to the test in this direct comparison between the two directors and their universes. Welcome to Stats In. If you're just joining us, please subscribe and don't forget to turn on notifications bell for more video. I was one of those people who thought that no one could ever beat Henry Cavill's portrayal of Superman in Zack Snyder's DCU. However, looking at the James Gunn flick, I think that David Corenswet is indeed the better Superman in terms of almost everything. James Gunn's Superman has been released to the world, and the reviews have been great. Although many doubted Gunn's capabilities for handling such a big IP, including me, the director has proved himself again with his abilities and the will to run the DCU. After watching Superman, we couldn't help but compare Gunn's take on the classic superhero versus Zack Snyder's version in his 2013 film Man of Steel. Well, here's the definitive comparison about the two Supermans and which of the two directors did it better. Although Amy Adams' Lois Lane was supposed to be the tough journalist who doesn't need anyone by her side, she ended up being just a love interest for Henry Cavill's Superman in the DCU. The Superman ending explained. What happened to Ultraman and Lex Luthor? Being the symbol of hope, James Gunn's take on the iconic character was much better than Zack Snyder's darker and grittier take in his DCU universe. Henry Cavill's Clark Kent looked like he was fighting for his survival in Man of Steel and the DCU. However, David Corenswet's Superman felt like he was fighting for his love of humanity and was hopeful about Earthlings, not just himself. Considering how Clark Kent was always raised as a character who would put humanity first and himself later on, I do believe that naivety was seen on David Corenswet's face as he assumed everyone on Earth to be a good human, unlike Henry Cavill's Man of Steel. Hence, I think that David Corenswet is the better Superman of the two. Although the role of Jor-El and Lara Lor-Van was portrayed by Bradley Cooper and Angela Sarafian in James Gunn's Superman, they weren't as good as Zack Snyder's casting in the 2013 film Man of Steel. Ayelet Zurer and Russell Crowe had a phenomenal performance as Superman's biological parents in Man of Steel, especially how Ayelet Zurer's Lara Lor-Van was shown as a ferocious woman who would do anything to defend her son. The video message from Bradley Cooper and Angela Sarafian served as a key plot point in the James Gunn flick. But, for me, I think that Zack Snyder did it better with Man of Steel. With less and less screen time, Amy Adams' portrayal of Lois Lane was reduced to being a damsel in distress rather than helping out Superman. In the case of the DCU flick, Rachel Brosnahan's portrayal of Lois Lane was as iconic as it can be, thanks to James Gunn's comments. Throughout the movie, there has been no single scene where David Corenswet's Clark Kent saves Lois Lane from a calamity. Instead, it's Lois Lane who ends up rescuing Superman when things get tough for the Man of Steel. Naturally, Rachel Brosnahan had the better portrayal of Lois Lane than Amy Adams. Songs for the fight scenes in the James Gunn flick were quite iconic, as the scene of Mr. Terrific fighting off everyone while the music amps up for the audience was simply breathtaking. The music for Man of Steel was composed by legendary composer Hans Zimmer. Although the composer refused to use John Williams' Imperial March, the composition for fight scenes and intense moments was done better by Hans Zimmer. Despite a controversial choice of not using the Imperial March, the point for the best music goes to Man of Steel. James Gunn has a knack for adding songs from the 60s and the 80s into almost every movie that he has ever directed. Of course, choosing to use a new version of John Williams' Imperial March was the best decision that composer John Murphy made for Superman. There is more to the movie than meets the eye. On the other hand, James Gunn's decision to have some continuous shots felt more natural and smooth in terms of the screenplay. Mr. Terrific's fight scene, Kal-El's laser beaming everyone in the sky, and the anti-proton river leading into a black hole felt smooth and natural. However, Zack Snyder's Man of Steel often felt clunky and jittery at times, as there were no clear transitions from one scene to the other. Therefore, I preferred Superman's cinematography over Man of Steel. Well, this was a tough call to make. I mean, both directors have done a remarkable job in terms of cinematography for Man of Steel as well as Superman. Zack Snyder's fight scenes felt somewhat unnatural and forced, as it was often a barrage of punches and kicks until they picked him up and threw him to a different scene set, not to say that it wasn't bad. But, considering that Superman's fighting scenes shouldn't feel clunky and should have a smooth progression, the fight scenes in James Gunn's Superman are better than Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. We're in the end. Rachel Brosnahan's impactful role in Superman will boost her profile for Apple TV Plus's show, benefiting both her career and the show's viewership. Welcome to Stats In. If you're just joining us, please subscribe and don't forget to turn on notifications bell.